For our last virtual lab exercise, you will have an opportunity to combine several different aspects of your knowledge of molecular structure to solve a structural puzzle. Specifically, you will employ your knowledge of mass spectra, infrared spectra, and elemental analysis to find the molecular formula for an unknown environmental contaminant containing only carbon, hydrogen, and fluorine. However, as is often the case, there will be multiple structural isomers possible for that contaminant, and you will need to apply your knowledge of symmetry and dipole vector addition to find the possible isomers that have no net molecular dipole. Our objectives for this exercise include using various experimental data to determine a molecular formula, analyzing the symmetry elements of a planar hydrocarbon, determining all the possible fluorinated isomers of the hydrocarbon, and summing bond dipoles to find the total dipole. By now, we have experienced several methods for finding the identity of an unknown using indirect techniques like spectroscopy. Specifically, we can extract the following kinds of information from different experimental measurements. For mass spectra, we can determine the total mass of a compound from the highest mass peak in the spectrum, and learn something about its major fragments from the fragmentation pattern. This ultimately provides us with the molecular weight and some structural information. From infrared spectra, we often learn about different bonds present in a molecule when their characteristic vibrational frequencies appear prominently in the spectrum. Most importantly, we can determine if a molecule is an alkane or an alkene, whether it has an OH bond, and whether it has a carbonyl bond, that is, a double bond between carbon and oxygen. Finally, elemental analysis indicates the mass percent of various elements in the molecule. This is useful for finding the empirical formula of a compound. Note that with both the molecular weight from the mass spectrum and the empirical formula from the elemental analysis, one can determine the molecular formula for the compound. We will actually find the molecular formula through an analysis of the molecular weight of the parent hydrocarbon, the molecule in which the fluorines are replaced by hydrogens. To illustrate this last point, suppose that one has a molecule whose molecular weight has mass 138, and we know from the elemental analysis that the number of fluorine atoms is 2. Fluorine, like hydrogen, forms only one bond, so it is a direct substitute for hydrogen on a parent molecule that contains only carbon and hydrogen. The molecular weight for this parent hydrocarbon is found by subtracting 19 for each fluorine atom and adding 1 for the hydrogen used to replace it. In this case, it would be 138 minus 2 times 18, or 102. Once we have the molecular weight of the parent hydrocarbon, there are a limited number of ways that we can combine carbons and hydrogens to add up to this total. If there are 7 carbons in the present example, then when this mass is subtracted from 102, the remaining mass of 18 must all represent hydrogen atoms. However, this is more hydrogens than can be accommodated by 7 carbons. If there are 8 carbons, this would imply a total of 6 hydrogens, and this represents a better possibility. 9 carbons have more mass, 108, than the parent hydrocarbon at 102, so this would not be possible. Our conclusion is that the only possibility is a hydrocarbon of formula C8H6. When we now introduce the 2 fluorine atoms, this gives us a formula of C8H4F2 for the unknown fluorinated contaminant. It's always a good idea to check this type of result, and indeed C8H4F2 would have a total mass of 138. Finally, we can look up the formula of the parent hydrocarbon in the NIST webbook to determine what possible structures it might represent. Normally, you should use the first possibility listed for the parent hydrocarbon, but for the sake of this example, we'll assume that it is the second compound listed, bicyclo-4,2,0-octatetrene, shown here. Once we have identified a suitable parent hydrocarbon, we will need to determine the various isomers that may be formed by substituting the fluorines for the hydrogens in the unknown. You should attempt to do this systematically so that you can avoid double counting the isomers that you find. For example, in this first isomer, there's only one way to attach the 2 fluorines to the 4-membered ring structure. However, as we construct isomers in which one fluorine is on the 4-membered ring and one is on the benzene ring, there may be other combinations that result in an equivalent compound. These are shown for the next 4 isomers. Finally, we will have some isomers in which both fluorines are attached to the benzene ring. The first two of these have equivalent structures as shown, but the last two can only be constructed one way. Thus we find that there are 9 distinguishable structural isomers possible for the compound containing 2 fluorines. A molecule will only have a total dipole if its bond-dipole vectors do not cancel one another. This is illustrated for the case of water, H2O. For the purposes of this exercise, we will assume that the carbon-hydrogen bond dipoles generally cancel one another, and we can focus solely on the contributions from the carbon-fluorine bond dipoles. Note that this approximation is not actually true of our example molecule, but it will be true of the samples that you will analyze. Now that we have identified the possible structural isomers, we need to analyze each of them to see if the carbon-fluorine bond dipole vectors will cancel each other when added together, as they do in carbon dioxide shown here. In essence, we will want to find isomers in which the carbon-fluorine bond dipole vectors point in opposite directions. As we examine each isomer, it should be apparent that only 2 appear to satisfy this criterion, and they are highlighted here. These fluorinated molecules would then be good candidates for the contaminants in this exercise. Your analysis procedure has several steps which are spelled out in the lab background and instructions document. They include using the experimental data given to determine the molecular weight and formula of your compound, identifying the parent hydrocarbon, formulating the possible isomers of the fluorinated unknown, and analyzing the isomers and identifying those whose carbon-fluorine bond dipoles cancel one another. Your analysis should be recorded by completing the information requested on the Lab 4 report worksheet and answering the post-analysis questions. When you have finished this and submitted the report, each team member should complete the lab review quiz within 24 hours. Good luck, and please let me know if you have questions or run into any difficulties in your analysis.